Hello everyone, I'm currently Kevin and I wanted to make a guide on Vanessa to help people get 7 wins in the Bazaar consistently to get those chests and get those gems. I've seen a lot of people struggle, specifically on the subreddit, talking about how people keep getting these great builds and stuff like that. So I want to start with the very first option you are presented, which is, do you pick the gold and the income, the enchanted item, or the gold skill? Let's go from worst to best, in my eyes. The worst is probably the gold and the income, because even though Vanessa is kind of gold hungry, especially in the mid game, you don't get the items that you want early. You are very dependent on the shops and on the monsters that you get, which often leaves you with a much weaker day 1 board than people who just pick the enchanted item or the skill. And losing early is not good for Vanessa. You want to win these early days. It will make things so much easier later on. Now the second one, I think, is the gold skill. It is better than the gold because if you get the flat damage for your left or rightmost weapon, that gives you a very good early game start. You can go for something like Fang or literally any low cooldown item and you're pretty set for the early game. The other one is left or rightmost item gains 24% crit, which can be amazing if you want to transition into something like Powder Keg. It makes that so much easier, and a lot of builds can make some use of it. Especially something like the one weapon build in the mid game, which really wants that crit, because it won't be 100% crit saturated. In the late game, you don't need the crit, it's kind of useless, but in the mid game it can be very useful. But the enchanted item, it just gives you so many options. So not only can you pick an item that you want to make your day 1 and day 2 better, you can also pick an enchantment that you want, or maybe you even just get the nuts. For example, if you get something like Obsidian Lighter, you are basically guaranteed with a 7-win victory. I've gotten it, I think, 4 times, and 1 time it was a 9-win, and 3 times it was a 10-win. It is very, very, very good. Other really good options are Catfish and Jellyfish, specifically with Shield, Heal, and Obsidian. Mostly because early on, the fights are very long. They often go to Sandstorm. So if you have a poison item, that can be very helpful. And there isn't any sort of like crazy scaling, so healing and shielding is extremely powerful. Now you don't need Obsidian on the Lighter. Lighter in general is just a good item because it's just a small item with a low cooldown, with burn that you can increase pretty easily. So a lot of the enchantments are actually pretty good for Lighter. Now you won't always get these options, obviously. So if you don't get these options, you just try to pick the best item or the best item enchantment combo to make your day 1 and day 2 boards as strong as possible to try to win those. Or you can just go for the enchantment, go for like an obsidian or a shiny and try to transform it into something good. Although that is pretty random, but you can get some really good items with that are build defining. Now for day 1 builds, I'll put a couple on screen. It's pretty random, but you just want high DPS weapons or something like a poison, shield, heal build. Now, as for early game builds, I think there's only really 2. Again, the Bazaar is just, it is very random. You can get a lot of different items and a lot of different combinations and you can make something work. But if you want some sort of like template, then you want something like Shark Claw or Aquatic build. Now Shark Claw is very easy, right? You get Shark Claw, you get a bunch of weapons. You don't really care about crit, although Calico is very good. You just care about low cooldown weapons, specifically small weapons. And you just throw them all in there, upgrade the Shark Claw, and that's basically it. It's a very simple build with still a lot of items to choose from, but generally speaking, lots of small items with low cooldown or multicast will work. So for aquatic builds, you're mostly looking for lots of small aquatic items, specifically to activate things like seashell, pearl, seaweed. Now of these 2, I prefer Shark Claw, especially with the recent XP nerfs. It just makes the health pools a lot lower and makes weapon builds a lot better. It is also relatively easy to transition. You can even use Shark Claw with some mid-game builds and mid-game items, with items like Submarine and Submersible, giving you some sustain. And it's pretty simple because you just upgrade Shark Claw, you have lots of money. If you go aquatic build, while it can be quite strong, You have a lot of small aquatic items that you just want to buy to activate things like seashell, pearl, seaweed, but they're not actually that good, and the next day or the next shop, you just have to replace them. This is going to cost you a lot of money, as well as a lot of the upgrades in the aquatic build are quite good. Upgrading seaweed or pearl is basically making them twice as good, at least going from bronze to silver. This is also costing you money. So what ends up happening is you're often running out of gold. Now this doesn't have to be a problem, but it can make it more difficult to transition into some of the late game builds and often limits your options. Now you can remedy this with something like a cove or an ambergris that will allow you to accumulate money, and then when it's time to transition, you can sell it, you can buy the items that you need, and that will basically solve that problem for you. Still, my preferred build is Shark Claw because it's just so strong right now. Weapon spam builds are strong. It is even strong enough to get 10 wins, although that is pretty unlikely. You basically have to win every single day. But I've gotten quite a few 7 wins before transitioning into my late game build with the Shark Claw build that I just upgraded. Now, let's talk a little bit about the mid game. Although I would say there's not much to say or a lot to say depending on how you look at it. The mid game is a little tricky because it is very RNG dependent, because the mid game is basically between day 3 and day 6. So it's very dependent on what monsters you get, what items you get from those monsters, what shops you get. There isn't really a mid game build guide because there are just so many different options of just items you pick up that you don't really invest into, that aren't really that good, but they're good enough. Now, a lot of times I don't even bother with this and I just stick with either my Shark Claw build or my aquatic build and try to transition into my late game build, right? Just try to win as many fights as possible while setting up for that late game build and just basically ignoring the mid game. But sometimes your starter build or your early build just doesn't cut it and it's just falling behind consistently. If that happens, then you might want to transition into a mid-game build. So I'll put some mid-game builds here on screen of builds that I went that are significantly different from the Shark Claw or the aquatic builds. And you can kind of see what I am trying to look for and what kind of items can work. But that's basically it for the mid-game. Again, I tend to just kind of skip the mid-game, or at least, stick with my early game, try to prepare for the late game, and that's kind of it. Which means it's now time to talk about transitions. Let's talk about when you should be transitioning, what to look for, and when and how to make the switch. I tend to just follow a couple of golden rules for myself. For example, right now I would say the one weapon build is probably the most consistent Vanessa build. It definitely used to be. With the XP nerfs, it might go to something like Shark Claw. Although again, getting the Shark Claw to 10 wins is quite rare, and getting it to 7 wins, while it does happen, can be a bit of a struggle. Okay, as for rule number 1, I basically always pick up an early electric eel, an early orange Julian, a day 1 long john, or a Shark Claw. Eel can be upgraded early and is just very strong right now. Orange Julian is very cheap. It's only like 4 gold when it's bronze. It just builds up over time. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to invest into it. In the late game, it can become very strong. It can even replace Shark Claw in the mid game. Now, a day 1 long john can become a very good one weapon build weapon, but it can also do a lot of damage in the mid game. Now, you can still pick up a long john on day 2, but it has to be before the monster, otherwise I wouldn't even touch it. Shark Claws is, like I said, also a very strong option, a very strong early build, and it just opens up a lot of the weapon-based builds in the mid game if you need to transition to that. Now, rule number 2. If you have lost the first 3 or 4 days, or you're at like day 6 and you only have 2 wins, you really want to start looking for something like a powder keg or a Boulder build. Because one-shot builds are basically the only Vanessa builds I've been able to get 10 wins with consistently while I had a bad start. Now, they can be a little hard to put together, but they are definitely the strongest Vanessa builds right now, especially in like power and speed, but you still need to get them assembled first. Now, rule number 3. If you went an aquatic build, you really want to look for a depth charge. It is the easiest transition. And like I said, you often don't have a lot of gold. And elemental depth charge is quite cheap because you only really need the depth charge, Yeti crab, and usually something to speed up the depth charge, like a Zorasid, which is also an aquatic item that you probably have already. If you do have the gold, however, or you have like an ambergris, you shouldn't be afraid to pivot to something completely different. Now you want to start looking for items and skills for your transition starting at day 4, and your early game build is probably going to be pretty useless after day 6 to 8, so you definitely want to be ready with the transition by then, but the earlier you can transition, the better. Now if your build isn't keeping up anymore, you might just want to transition and hope for the best, because you'd be surprised at how often your build ends up working with the extra gold you get from selling all the other items and not having to worry about 2 builds at the same time. You definitely also do not need to be fully done with the build before transitioning, and half transitions are completely fine. You just throw that powder keg with some burn items in your weapon or aquatic build, and then just slowly upgrade the powder and change out the weapons or change out the aquatics. You can have 1 weapon builds with only a crow's nest and a weapon, or even just a crow's nest and multiple weapons, just waiting for a good weapon for your 1 weapon build to show up, and you just use the crit. I even had a 1 weapon build without crow's nest or any healing at all, which is pretty risky and I don't normally do. But it worked, and it doesn't really need to be pretty, it just needs to win. Now, let's talk a little bit about late game builds and what items you want to look for. I'll keep it pretty condensed for this video, since there's a lot to talk about, but I'm planning on making a second video, or even more videos, talking about the specifics of certain builds and how you go about building them, and what you want to look for, and all that good stuff. But for now, I mainly just want to stick to the items you want to use, the skills you want to use, and what I think of the builds. So first up are the 1 weapon builds. These usually consist of a crow's nest, a 1 weapon, and a combination of something like a silencer, custom scope, orange Julian, rowboat, captain's wheel, shadow cloak, cardable, and swashbuckler. Okay, that's a lot. Let me just show you some examples of the builds so you can see what I mean. As you can see, custom scope is usually paired with orange Julian or card table, but it can also be paired with rowboat or captain's wheel if you don't have a silencer and it can sit on the other side. Card table only works with electric eel or with a medium or small weapon, so you can fit an orange Julian. Swashbuckler is very good if you don't have an item to trigger with custom scope, like you didn't pick up an orange Julian or you don't have an eel, so card table is not that useful, as it gives a ton of upfront damage, which is very helpful. It also only has 2 enchantment options, and both are good, which is very helpful, especially if your main weapon is already enchanted and you don't get a good other enchantment. You can just throw it on the swashbuckler and you're always going to be happy. For weapons, you want to look at electric eel, submarine, submersible, which is basically better than the submarine, flagship, Long John, if you picked it up really early and it's been scaling, can be very, very powerful. And that's pretty much it. Any skill that can increase your damage here is also pretty great. Flat damage, but also scaling skills like slow and steady or trained from the Kyverd run, giving you damage when you slow, which is especially good for something like eel. Improvised weaponry, giving your items damage when you crit. Or streamline weapon, giving your weapon damage if you already have haste on it and you get haste on it again. You also don't want to ignore haste skills, especially if you don't have a permanent haste already, or charge skills. Anything that lets you attack faster also increases your damage. Now the pros of this build, it's very easy to assemble with lots of different options. It has great scaling potential. It's good against other weapon builds and scaling builds. The cons are you can get permanently frozen quite easily. You can get one shot unless you have like a shielded enchantment on your weapon and you go first. If you're using electric eel, you can struggle against builds with large items with long cooldowns and powerful effects. This build also kind of falls off in day 13 plus because of bloated health pools, although less so now with the XP nerfs. There will be less builds that rely on chipping your health away slowly, so the healing doesn't really matter, doesn't really benefit you as much. But it's still an extremely powerful build. Now, next up are the one-shot builds. One-shot builds are very powerful because they counter health scaling, regen, healing, and all that good stuff, and they can be very, very fast. Powder keg used to be king here, but it has gotten nerfed due to the XP nerfs, since you want to get the keg to diamond and give it a 100% crit chance in order to do 100% of the enemy's health. So getting to level 13 for the guaranteed upgrade takes a lot longer, and that means keg is a lot harder to build. Still, it is the most powerful Vanessa build if you can get it together. You want to use any of these items on screen right now to get your keg to 100%. Now, if you've done that, you want to work on charging it as fast as possible. Now for this you want fast burn items, but most of all you want incendiary rounds or heated shells. Heated shells is better than incendiary rounds, but it is a little bit more difficult to get. Although if you do get C4 as one of your skill vendors, you should always pick him, since he only has 9 skills and you're very likely to get heated shells. Once you have heated shells or incendiary rounds, you want to use items such as nesting doll, shot glass, throwing knives, grape shot, revolver. Incendiary rounds, you can also use any low cooldown item, and you should if you can get them. But I tend to use mostly ammo items so I can more easily transition into heated shells. Holster is also incredibly important since you only need 1 or 2 rounds of item activations in order to charge the power keg, and every second counts, so holster is incredible. Now the pros for this build, it is basically the ultimate late game build. It's one of the fastest builds if properly assembled. We're talking about a 2 or 3 second one shot here. It is also a pretty great fallback if you didn't get your early wins because it's the ultimate late game build. Now the cons. It basically has a non-existent early or mid game. You can go for a burn build and kind of like work your way into the powder keg. That is fine. But you need something to keep you afloat while you get your keg online. Now another con is, unless you enchant your keg with burn, poison or obsidian, basically any sort of shield will stop your one shot. It is also pretty hard to get powder keg to diamond due to the recent XP nerfs, but it is still very possible and it's still incredibly powerful. Now next in the one shot category is the Boulder. Luckily the Boulder didn't really care about the XP nerfs, although getting it to diamond is still powerful, but you can make it work without it. For this build, you are looking for either defensive items that allow you to stay alive while the boulder charges, or hasting and charging the boulder as fast as possible. You can mix and match here, that's totally fine. For non-monster skills and items, Silencer and Star Shard are obvious candidates for cooldown reduction. Captain's Wheel and Zoricid are regulars of this build. Zoricid only if you have no Silencer, and possibly with some burn items. For skills, you are really looking for Shield Bash and Alacrity if you have crit. For defensive items, it's a bit more varying. You can just throw a single life preserver in there to protect yourself against the enemy one-shots. Or you can put in a turtle shell and pearls, or a port with haste and freeze potions. Picking up anything that works well together is the key here. Even then, you probably still need something to haste or charge a boulder, since waiting 16 or 20 seconds is a very long time, and you're giving your enemy a lot of time to scale. Now, for the good stuff, you really want Juggler from Trash Titan, Pendulum from Lord of the Wastes, and Eclipse from Lord Arkan. Luckily, all of these monsters are pretty easy to kill with the boulder, but you do want to be careful about Lord Arkan and his small shields. If you can't remove them, and if he survives, he will heal back to full with his potion and with his Eclipse. Now, for the pros of this build, the second you have a boulder, you have a one-shot build, even if it is very slow. There are lots of different variants and items that work and that I've made work. Now the cons is it starts off very slow. The best items and skills for this build are locked behind RNG, mostly monster drops. It does also lose to shields unless you crit or have obsidian or have glass cannon, some way to increase the boulder's damage beyond 100%. Now for an honorable mention in the one-shot category is the Arbalest. Arbalest is a mid-game one-shot build. Now you probably won't get 10 wins with this, but it's a great way to get 7 wins. Shot Glass, Jellyfish, Sea Dog Saloon, Piano, and Holster are the main staples of this build, although there are plenty of decent options for this build that you will probably use on the way to perfecting this board. Something like a Beach Ball, Anchor, Dive Weights, Water Wheel, Zoricid are all very useful. The build is very flexible, you just want to haste as much as possible before the Arbalest hits. Now this makes it pretty easy to assemble. All you need is an Arbalest, since haste items are very plentiful, and you probably already have a random jellyfish or something laying around. Second, it is really strong early. With the lower health pools and Arbalest front-loaded damage, you can easily cruise through the mid-game and into those 7 wins. I was doing about 1700 damage when the health pools were about 700. The problem is, it probably won't do a whole lot more than 1700 damage, and the health pools really start to catch up with you. Now the pros for this build, it's super easy to assemble, you probably just fall right into it, and it's very strong in the early and the mid game. The cons, however, it is very weak in the late game, and it's quite slow, so it's quite vulnerable to disruption and other fast builds. Now for our third build type, it is the Yeti Freeze Poison build. Now this mostly consists of Yeti Crab, Elemental Depth Charge, and Iceberg. Anything else is mostly just extra. Aquatic items to give elemental depth charge multicast, freeze to trigger Yeti crab, healing or shielding to keep yourself alive while the poison ticks, and anything that gives depth charge ammo is very useful. You just do whatever you need to get the strongest board. If you get poison on the iceberg, you can even forgo the elemental depth charge entirely and just focus on staying alive while iceberg keeps poisoning. Now you want to upgrade Yeti crab and the depth charge first, and you want to try to enchant the iceberg with poison if you can, and then enchant the depth charge with something like radiant, poison, or crit. Or you can even get a catfish or a jellyfish with heal or shield enchant to keep you alive. It will heal or shield for like 2000, it's incredible. Now the pros of this build, it's a very easy transition from the strong early game aquatic builds into this depth charge. It only requires 2 or 3 items depending on your enchants, so there's a lot of flexibility here. The cons are, the mid game is a little bit mediocre. It is quite slow, but it's still very powerful when it does go off. Bloated health pools are definitely still a problem for the ticking poison in the late game. Now if you're using the iceberg, it is quite vulnerable to large item builds that do a lot of damage and one-shot builds because they don't trigger the iceberg as often. Now, moving on to weapon spam builds. With the recent XP nerfs, weapon spam builds are coming back into the meta. It's really hard to pin down weapon builds because there are endless variations, but I mostly just go shark claws. These are some of the weapons you want to put on your shark claw build. These do not include any good items for monsters or shovel or hero merchants, so if you get a low cooldown weapon, you definitely want to use that. Electric eel, submarine, and submersible are just strong items in general, even if they don't take full advantage of the shark claw buff. Both of the subs can help you with sustaining and allowing the shark claw to go off more often. Now another option is cannonade, which you can play with or without shark claws. It is a little bit more flexible because you don't have to wait for the shark claw to go off to do your damage. This gives you a couple more options like a throwing knife and holster. Generally, I find shark claws to be more effective, but if you can't find a shark claw or you can't upgrade it, cannonade is a pretty good option. Now you can also go a full ammo build. You'll need something to help you get more ammo into your guns, otherwise you will run out before you do enough damage. Luckily, there are many ways in both skills and items that can help you there. I'll put some on the screen. Ammo items do have an upside because there are a lot of skills and items that work really well with ammo items to make them worth running. Loaded Fury, Sharpshooter, Parting Shot for skills, Ballista, Pistol Sword, Repeater, and Torpedo for items, as some examples. Getting augmented weaponry from Trashdown Mayor is going to be great for all weapon spam builds, since it gives you a lot of damage up front and makes you a lot less reliant on other skills and items. This gives you a lot more freedom in what weapons you want to use, like you can use a submersible, submarine, or even an Orange Julian, since you don't have to wait to start doing damage. Speaking of Orange Julian, if you do get him early, and you can survive until he goes off, he is better than shark claws most of the time. The problem is obviously the long cooldown, and you really don't want to be waiting 10 seconds to start doing damage, but if you do have ways to sustain, or you have ways to haste or charge the Orange Julian, he can become a complete powerhouse that will help you compete even in the late game. Imagine a shark claw that gives like 100 to 200 damage instead of 30 to 40. As you can see, there's a lot to say about weapon builds, and it feels like I just scratched the surface with this, but I think I covered some of the most important parts. There are some other builds as well, but these are my main staples, and if I didn't include a build, it's either because I don't know enough about the build, or I just think they're unreliable. Okay, so that was kind of like the basics of how I play Vanessa. Thank you if you got to this part of the video, I really appreciate it. If you have any feedback or any questions, just put them in the comments. I'll read them, I'll respond to them, and maybe I can make a video about it and teach some more cool stuff. Now, since you got to this part of the video, consider subscribing. I'll definitely be making more videos. A lot of them are going to be shorter, but I'm still going to have some big guides like this one. And I hope to see you in the next video.